When the Second World War finally came to an end in 1945, the world began to discover the horrifying truth hidden behind the walls of Nazi concentration camps. Across Europe, investigators uncovered evidence of unimaginable suffering, and those responsible for the crimes were brought before courts to answer for what they had done. Among the most infamous places discovered by Allied forces was Bergen-Belsen, a concentration camp in northern Germany. When British soldiers entered the camp in April 1945, they were met with a scene that shocked even those who had witnessed the horrors of war. Thousands of bodies lay scattered across the camp. Prisoners, weakened by starvation and disease, were barely alive. The ground was filled with the remains of people who had died because of hunger, neglect, and brutal conditions. The camp was no longer functioning as a normal prison. It had become a place where human life had been reduced to survival. Inside this nightmare was a group of people who had helped maintain the system of cruelty, the SS guards. One of the guards captured after the liberation of Bergen-Belsen was a woman who immediately stood out from the others. Her name was Herta Bothe. Standing around 6 feet 3 inches tall, wearing heavy boots and carrying herself with authority, she appeared physically intimidating even among soldiers. Prisoners remembered her as a harsh and violent figure. Because of her height and reputation, she later became known as the Giant of Bergen-Belsen. But who was Herta Bothe before she became a concentration camp guard? How did a young German woman become part of one of the darkest systems in human history? Herta Bothe was born on January 3, 1921, in Mecklenburg, Germany. Like many young people growing up under Nazi rule, she was exposed to the ideology of Adolf Hitler's regime from an early age. As a teenager, she became involved with the League of German Girls, the female youth organization connected to the Nazi Party. The group promoted Nazi beliefs and prepared young women for the roles the regime expected from them. Girls were taught household skills, obedience, and the idea that they had a duty to serve Hitler's Germany. Bothe also helped her father in his woodworking business. At first, her life appeared ordinary. But like thousands of others during this period, she grew up surrounded by propaganda and political indoctrination. In 1942, at the age of 21, Herta Bothe joined the SS. She was sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp, a place where female guards were trained before being assigned to other camps. Ravensbrück became known as a training ground for women who would later become some of the most feared guards in the Nazi camp system. There, Bothe learned how the SS operated. She was trained to control prisoners and enforce the brutal rules of the concentration camp system. After completing her training, she was transferred to Stutthof concentration camp near Danzig. It was at Stutthof that prisoners began to recognize her for her cruelty. Bothe gained a reputation as a violent overseer. Survivors later described her as someone who used fear and physical punishment to control prisoners. She was accused of beating inmates and treating them with extreme harshness. Years later during her trial, she attempted to minimize her actions. When questioned about whether she had ever beaten prisoners, she admitted that she had struck people with her hands, claiming it was only because they had stolen materials such as wood. However, survivors told a different story. They described a guard who used her position of power to intimidate and punish prisoners who had almost no ability to defend themselves. After spending roughly 2 years at Stutthof, Bothe was moved to another location. In 1944, she was transferred to the Brombergost subcamp before eventually becoming part of a forced evacuation as the German military began losing ground. By early 1945, Soviet forces were advancing from the east. As the Nazi regime collapsed, many concentration camps were evacuated. Prisoners were forced to march long distances in terrible conditions. Thousands died during these brutal evacuations, later known as death marches. Herta Bothe was involved in one of these movements and eventually arrived at Bergen-Belsen. By the time she reached the camp, Bergen-Belsen was already collapsing. The number of prisoners had increased dramatically as people were transferred there from other camps. The camp was overcrowded, food supplies were almost non-existent, and medical care had completely broken down. Disease spread rapidly. Typhus became one of the biggest killers. Every day, prisoners died from starvation, sickness, and exhaustion. Bothe was assigned duties inside this failing camp system. Unlike some other guards, she often wore civilian clothing rather than a traditional uniform, but prisoners still recognized her because of her unusual height and intimidating presence. At Bergen-Belsen, she was eventually placed in charge of a work group known as the Wood Commando. The prisoners under her control were forced to collect and carry wood, a physically demanding task carried out by starving and exhausted people. Although Bothe later claimed that she simply supervised the workers and had little involvement with prisoners, survivors accused her of using violence against those under her command. Some witnesses claimed they saw her beating prisoners with her hands. Others accused her of using objects to attack inmates and of severely punishing people caught taking small amounts of food or materials. One of the accusations against her was that she brutally punished prisoners who took discarded food scraps, such as vegetable peelings, because they were desperate from starvation. In a camp where people were dying every day from hunger, even a few scraps of food could mean the difference between life and death. When British forces liberated Bergen-Belsen on April 15, 1945, the horrors inside the camp were finally exposed to the world. The British soldiers forced surviving SS personnel to help clear the bodies of the dead. Herta Bothe was among those ordered to assist with removing corpses from the camp. She later described this experience, saying that the condition of the bodies was horrifying. She claimed that remains were badly decomposed and that she feared becoming infected with disease. But to many observers, her complaints were shocking. She had been part of the system that allowed those conditions to exist in the first place. After liberation, Bothe was arrested and held before being brought to trial during the Bergen-Belsen trials. During the proceedings, prosecutors presented evidence and witness statements describing her behavior inside the camps. Bothe continued to deny many of the accusations against her. She admitted to striking prisoners, but insisted she never used weapons or deliberately murdered anyone. However, several survivors gave testimony describing her as a cruel and aggressive guard. There were also accusations that she had killed prisoners directly, including claims involving shootings and deadly assaults. However, some of these accusations could not be proven beyond doubt. This became an important factor in her sentence. Unlike some other female SS guards who received death sentences, Bothe avoided execution. One reason was that she had not served at Auschwitz, the camp most closely associated with industrialized mass murder, and the strongest evidence against her involved brutality rather than confirmed participation in systematic killings. In 1947, Herta Bothe was sentenced to 10 years in prison for her involvement in the Nazi concentration camp system. However, she did not serve the full sentence. She was released early on December 21, 1951. After her release, she lived a private life away from public attention. She survived for decades and died in 2000 at the age of 79. In later years, Bothe claimed that she had not chosen her role freely and suggested that refusing to serve as a guard would have caused problems for her. She argued that she had made a mistake by working in a concentration camp, but did not accept full responsibility for the suffering connected to her actions. Her story remains disturbing because it shows how ordinary individuals could become involved in systems of extreme cruelty. Herta Bothe was only in her early 20s when she became an SS guard. She was not a high-ranking Nazi official, nor was she a leader of the regime. She was one person inside a massive system built on violence, hatred, and obedience. But history remembers her because she played a role in that system. The prisoners of Bergen-Belsen experienced unimaginable suffering, and the guards who enforced the rules of the camp became part of that tragedy. Herta Bothe's story is not just about one woman. It is a reminder of how propaganda, power, and blind obedience can transform ordinary people into participants in extraordinary crimes. And decades later, the name Herta Bothe remains connected to one of the darkest chapters in human history.